Dragons swam in oceans, and Jerusalem anchored the entire earth. Medieval mapmakers, the cartographers of conquest, did not just draw coastlines. They dreamed entire worlds onto parchment and deceived with deliberate ink. By the end of this, you will understand how a simple map could launch invasions and rewrite reality itself. How did a mythical king appear on maps for 300 years? Why would a mapmaker intentionally leave a continent blank? These ancient charts were not scientific documents. They were weapons of ideology shaped by faith and a hunger for power. Their beautiful lies shaped our world, and their lessons about manipulation are more urgent than ever. What part of your own world might be built on a similar, persuasive fiction? A single vellum page could require the skin of an entire sheep, a staggering cost that meant every map began as a declaration of value. These were not tools for the common person, but for the eyes of kings and cardinals. In the quiet of the monastery, the cartographer's task was not to chart a sailor's course, but to illustrate a divine plan. This spiritual purpose gave rise to the Mappa Mundi, a term that simply means maps of the world. But their design was anything but simple. They were dense theological diagrams, placing Jerusalem at the very center of the earth as the spiritual heart of creation. East was often oriented at the top, the direction of the rising sun and the Garden of Eden. The continents were distorted into a symbolic shape, a circle divided by waters into a T, known as the T and O map. This stood for Orbis Terrarum, the circle of lands. The known world was neatly partitioned among the three sons of Noah, a biblical division that made perfect theological sense, but bore little resemblance to the actual coastlines of Europe, Africa, and Asia. Why would a traveler's map show mythical beasts in the uncharted south, but leave out a major mountain range? Because its goal was not navigation, but education and affirmation. It was a visual sermon reinforcing a world view where every river and every island was part of a grand, holy story. This fundamental shift from earthly guide to spiritual artifact is the key that unlocks their strange beauty. It explains why accuracy was sacrificed for allegory, and why the cartographer's greatest skill was not surveying land, but interpreting scripture. With this sacred canvas established, the stage was set for the first great dreamers to pick up their pens. Its brilliant simplicity was its greatest power, a single circle, the O, containing all of creation, and within it, a T shaped by the great waters of the known world. The Mediterranean Sea formed the vertical stem of the T, separating Europe from Africa. The horizontal bar was drawn by the River Nile and the River Don, together fencing off the vast, mysterious continent of Asia at the top. This was the TO map, and to call it geographically inaccurate is to miss its point entirely. This was a map of the soul, a diagram of divine providence. At the very center, precisely where the lines of the T would intersect, sat Jerusalem. It was not just a city on a hill, it was the spiritual navel of the universe, the axis around which all of history and salvation revolved. The surrounding ocean was not merely a body of water, it was the boundary between the ordered world shaped by God's hand and the utter chaos that lay beyond. These were not navigational charts, they were moralized landscapes, as the historian David Woodward described them, compendiums of wonders and spiritual instruction. A river on such a map was not just a flow of water, it might represent the 4 rivers of paradise flowing from Eden. A mountain range was not just rock and earth. It could be the location where Noah's Ark came to rest. Every feature was assigned a role in a sacred story, transforming the entire Earth into a visual sermon for a population that could not read. This was the cartographers' first great dream. They dreamed of a universe that made perfect spiritual sense, a cosmos of profound comfort and certainty, even if it made very little geographical sense. But this beautiful, ordered dream of a God-centered world was a fragile one. It was about to be confronted by a new kind of hunger, a hunger not for spiritual certainty, but for gold, spices, and earthly power. But that divinely ordered world was not the only one being drawn. Alongside the spiritual dreamers, a more pragmatic kind of cartographer was at work, one who understood that information was power, and that power was best kept secret. Their primary tool was not allegory, but omission. While a Mappa Mundi might fill unknown territories with mythical beasts to teach a moral lesson, these new maps left them blank for a far more strategic reason: to deceive. Critical knowledge, like the precise location of a gold mine or the safest path through a treacherous mountain pass, was a state secret. To put it on a public map would be to hand a rival kingdom the keys to your treasury. So mapmakers, often working under direct orders from a patron, would simply erase it. A chart made for a king's war council would show a coastline in perfect detail, plotting every bay and river mouth for a naval invasion. That same coastline on a map available to merchants or foreign spies might be rendered as an empty, ominous stretch of shoreline, its waters populated by leviathans and its lands labeled as uninhabitable. This was the birth of information control through geography. A perfect example is the magnificent Catalan Atlas, a masterpiece of the 14th century. It presents the Mediterranean world with stunning accuracy, its ports and cities meticulously recorded for the benefit of trade. But then your eye moves south, across the Sahara into the interior of Africa, and the detail evaporates. The map becomes a canvas for fantastical stories of men with faces in their chests and rivers of gold, a deliberate act of cartographic misdirection. It was not that the mapmakers knew nothing. It was that they knew too much and chose to obscure the truth to protect commercial monopolies and fuel legends that served their patrons. A blank space on these maps was not a confession of ignorance. It was a declaration of intent, a silent, calculated lie etched into the parchment. Yet even the most magnificent spiritual dream was a luxury few could afford. If the TO map was a simple prayer, then the Hereford Mappa Mundi was an entire cathedral of vellum and ink. Created around the year 1300, this single, massive skin of calfskin parchment is a breathtaking spectacle. It is not a map for finding your way from one town to another. It is a map for finding your place in the cosmos. More than 500 illustrations jostle for space across its surface, a crowded dreamscape where the walls of Jericho tumble not far from the mythical tribes of Gog and Magog. The Garden of Eden, a perfect circle at the very top, looks down upon the entire human drama. You can see the Tower of Babel reaching for the heavens and trace the wanderings of the Israelites through the desert. All of this exists alongside real geographical features, like the British Isles and the Mediterranean Sea, but they are rendered almost as afterthoughts in this grander scheme. This was the ultimate spiritual encyclopedia, a single image attempting to hold all of time and space, from creation to the Last Judgment. Its dream was one of total comprehension, where every beast, every king, and every city had a preordained role in the story of salvation. It collapses centuries into a single moment, inviting the viewer not to travel across land, but to embark on a spiritual pilgrimage. You were meant to wander this parchment with your eyes and your soul, moving from the sin of Eden toward the hope of Jerusalem at the center. It represents the peak of a world, where faith provided the only true coordinates, and the physical world was merely a shadow of a greater, divine reality. This was a world explained, not explored, and that very need for explanation would soon be challenged by a new, terrifying force hurtling from the east, one that would shatter this beautiful, ordered dream and demand a completely new kind of map. But the most famous deceptions were not blank spaces, they were the monsters that swam in the margins. A single, chilling phrase echoes through history, "Here be dragons." Yet you will almost never find these exact words on a genuine medieval map. The deception was far more visual. Cartographers illustrated the edges of their parchment with a menagerie of the impossible. There was the sciapod, a man who used his single, giant foot as a sunshade. There were the cynosphali, a race of men with the heads of dogs who were said to bark their conversations. And perhaps most unsettling of all, the blemii, warriors whose faces were embedded directly in their chests. Where did these ideas come from? They were partly born from a potent mix of garbled travelers' tales and the authority of ancient texts where authors like Pliny the Elder described such wonders. But their placement on the map was no accident. These creatures did not inhabit France or Germany. They were always located at the farthest, most uncertain edges of the world, in the depths of Africa or the frozen wastes of the north. Their purpose was to draw a line not in the sand but in the human mind. On one side of the line was the known world, the realm of Christendom, order, and civilization. On the other side was the monstrous other, a land of chaos and subhuman beings. This was a powerful form of ideological propaganda. By depicting foreign peoples as literal monsters, the mapmaker made them less than human. This visual lie served a brutal, practical purpose. It justified the coming conquests. If the people across the sea were demons or beasts, then taking their land, converting them by force, or enslaving them was not an act of cruelty. It was a righteous crusade, a holy duty to tame the wild edges of God's creation. The dragon in the ocean was not just a warning to sailors, it was an invitation to kings. These beautiful, terrifying illustrations were weapons, carefully crafted to turn fear into a license for expansion and to make the unknown not just mysterious, but morally acceptable to invade. Centuries of spiritual certainty were about to be measured, calculated, and redrawn. A forgotten manuscript, Ptolemy's Geographia, resurfaced in 15th century Europe, and it proposed a world governed not by faith but by mathematics. This was a 2nd century Greek vision, a system that plotted every city and coastline using a grid of latitude and longitude. For scholars who had only known the TO map, this was like discovering a new language for describing reality itself. It was a scientific dream, one of objective precision and a recoverable classical past. Men like Francesco Berlingeri became obsessed, translating the ancient text and painstakingly drafting new maps based on its coordinates. The world that emerged on their parchments looked alien. Coastlines were reshaped, continents were repositioned according to a system of projection, and the entire Earth felt both more vast and more knowable. This was the intellectual spark that ignited the Renaissance and paved the way for the great age of discovery. For the first time, a map was not just a mirror for the soul, it was a tool for the ship's captain, a key to unlocking the physical world through empirical discovery. Yet this new dream of scientific objectivity was itself a kind of beautiful deception. Ptolemy's own data was flawed, his calculations based on the limited knowledge of the Roman Empire. His world was too small, and he had enclosed the Indian Ocean with a southern landmass, a colossal error that would haunt explorers for generations. The dream of a perfectly measured world was intoxicating, but it was a dream built on the biases and blind spots of an ancient scholar, proving that even a map based on math could lead you gloriously astray. Every line of ink on these maps was underwritten by power. The cartographer's most important tool was not his compass, but his patron. With a king or a pope paying for the parchment, the map inevitably became a mirror for their ambitions. This was the third great deception, the art of cartographic propaganda. A ruler's own territories might be drawn larger and more prosperous, their cities gleaming with impossible spires, while a rival's lands would shrink into insignificance. Coastlines could subtly shift to support a dubious claim to a strategic harbor, and vast, unexplored continents might be boldly labeled with the patron's name, a declaration of ownership made with ink long before it could be enforced with steel. Consider the Cantino planisphere, a map so valuable it was secretly smuggled out of Portugal. It meticulously charts the New World discoveries, but its true purpose was political. A vertical line slices through the Atlantic Ocean, a parchment representation of the Treaty of Tordesillas, which divided the entire non-European world between Spain and Portugal. This was not a scientific document. It was a legal argument and a warning to other nations, a statement of imperial domain drawn on sheepskin. The mapmaker's pen had become a diplomat's quill and a conqueror's sword, carving out fantasy empires that monarchs were desperate to make real. In this light, every beautiful illustration of a king seated firmly on his throne was not just decoration. It was the point of the entire exercise, a deliberate lie designed to legitimize authority and make ambition look like destiny. What borders on your own world map were drawn not by surveyors but by politicians? Yet another dream was being drawn, not for the soul's salvation but for the ship's survival. The Portolan Chart was a navigator's sacred text, a dense web of practical knowledge where the spiritual symbolism of the Mappa Mundi was replaced by the stark reality of coastlines. These were maps drawn from life, from the weathered logs of sailors and the first-hand accounts of merchants. Their most striking feature was the spiderweb of room lines, a network of directions radiating from central compass roses that allowed a captain to plot a straight course across open water. This was the dream of safe passage, a meticulous effort to tame the treacherous Mediterranean and Atlantic coasts. Look at the Carta Pisana, one of the oldest surviving portolans from the late 13th century. Its focus is narrow and intense, charting the literal with an almost obsessive detail. Every bay, every river mouth, every potential hazard is noted with a clarity that feels shockingly modern. The interior of the land is left blank, a silent admission that what mattered was not the kingdoms within, but the routes between them. This represented a fundamental shift in human ambition. The map was no longer a diagram of a divine plan. It was a tool for profit and connection. It dreamed of a world shrunk by commerce, where spices, silk, and gold could flow along predictable, charted paths. This pragmatic dream, built on empirical observation rather than theological certainty, was the crucial bridge. It proved that the world could be understood through measurement and experience, paving the way for the vast global charts that would soon reveal continents Europeans never knew existed. Amidst the room lines and sea monsters, the most powerful hand guiding the cartographer's quill was often that of the church. Bishops and monastic scriptoria were not just patrons, they were the primary keepers of all knowledge, including the shape of the world itself. Their profound influence ensured that the map remained, first and foremost, a tool for salvation. Consider the pilgrim setting out on a journey that could take years. For him, a map was a spiritual itinerary. The routes to sacred destinations were etched with special care, transforming the entire landscape into a pathway to grace. A road leading to Rome or Santiago de Compostela was not just a line on parchment. It was a via sacra, a holy road promising redemption at its end. And at the center of it all, of course, was Jerusalem, depicted not as a distant city, but as the ultimate goal of every Christian soul. This sanctification of space, however, had a far darker application. When the same meticulous care was applied to maps of the Holy Land, the result was not a guide for pilgrims but a blueprint for holy war. These Crusader maps showed Jerusalem not as it was, a city of diverse faiths, but as a captive Christian jewel, its sacred churches held by infidels. The geography itself was weaponized. Every mountain pass and river crossing was analyzed not for trade, but for troop movement. What was the spiritual difference between a pilgrim's journey and a knight's crusade? On these maps there was none. Both were framed as a sacred duty to reclaim a world lost to sin. This brilliant, terrifying fusion of faith and geography provided a moral alibi for invasion. It turned the brutal realities of military conquest into a divine mandate, a dream of purification written across entire continents. The cartographer in the service of the church was not just drawing land. He was drafting a call to arms, making the sword feel as holy as the prayer. But the most strategic deception of all was not a monster, but a king. For 300 years, the legend of Prester John haunted the edges of the known world, a phantom kingdom drawn onto parchment with the certainty of a real place. He was said to be a Christian emperor of immense piety and even greater power, ruling a land overflowing with gems and spices somewhere in the distant east. When the Mongol hordes erupted from Asia, European princes desperately hoped they were the armies of this lost Christian ally, finally coming to their aid. The maps reflected this fervent hope. Chartmakers, working with the best information available to them, which was a mixture of rumor and desire, placed his magnificent kingdom squarely in Central Asia. It was a perfect cartographic fiction, filling a blank space with a geopolitical fantasy. This was not an error, it was a deliberate act of hopeful propaganda. The dream of a powerful Christian brother, poised to strike the rear of the Islamic world, was simply too comforting and too strategically useful to leave off the map. Popes sent letters addressed to him. Explorers carried these letters on their voyages. The map had created a reality so compelling it began to dictate foreign policy and fund expeditions. When direct travel to Asia failed to find his court, the legend did not die. It simply migrated. Mapmakers, unwilling to abandon such a useful dream, picked up his entire kingdom and moved it. Now Prester John ruled the mountains of Ethiopia, a Christian island in a sea of unknown Africa. His realm was redrawn again and again, always just beyond the edge of exploration. Why did this mirage persist for so long? Because it served a vital purpose. It turned the terrifying emptiness of the map into a landscape of hope and possibility. It provided a divine justification for expansion, framing the search for wealth and allies as a holy quest to unite Christendom. This cartographic ghost guided the very real voyages of men like Vasco da Gama, who sailed around Africa clutching maps that promised a Christian ally on the other side. He was searching for a line of ink, a deception that had become more real than the coastlines he was actually discovering. The kingdom of Prester John was the ultimate proof that a map could be a prayer, a piece of strategic fiction so powerful it could launch ships and shape history itself. Perhaps the ultimate expression of this spiritual dream was the Ebstorf Map, a lost masterpiece known only through copies. This was not merely a map with religious symbols. It was a vision of the entire earth as the literal body of Christ. The world itself was his form, his head at the top in the east, his outstretched hands marking the northern and southern limits, and his feet together at the bottom in the west. And at the very center of this divine body, positioned precisely at the navel, was the city of Jerusalem. This was the world's true heart, the umbilicus of all creation. Every mountain, every river, every city on this map was more than a physical location. It was an expression of God's own flesh, a living part of a sacramental universe. To travel across the land was to journey across the body of the divine. This was the pinnacle of symbolic cartography, a breathtaking dream where geography, theology, and cosmology fused into a single, perfect whole. It offered a worldview of profound comfort and cohesion, where every single thing had its place in a divine plan. But this beautiful, all-encompassing vision had a dark and rigid edge. A world that was the body of Christ left no room for lands or peoples that did not fit its framework. What happened to cultures that worshipped other gods? They simply could not exist in this cartographic reality. They were erased by the very premise of the map. This was a dream of total integration that demanded total conformity, a perfect spiritual order that made the unknown not just monstrous, but theologically impossible. It was a dream that could not survive contact with a world far larger and more diverse than its parchment could possibly contain. While Europe was dreaming of a God-centered world on Vellum, a parallel universe of knowledge was flourishing under the patronage of Islamic caliphs. Far from the monastic scriptoria, cartographers in cities like Baghdad and Cairo were drawing the world with a different kind of dream, one rooted in mathematics, trade, and a vast network of travelers. Their maps were not sermons but syntheses pulling from Greek science, Persian geography, and the first-hand accounts of merchants who had sailed from the Swahili coast to the South China Sea. This was a tradition that saw the earth not as a divine allegory, but as a knowable, interconnected system. At the brilliant center of this endeavor stood a scholar named Al-Idrisi. In the 12th century, he worked for King Roger II of Sicily, a Norman ruler with an insatiable curiosity about the world beyond his kingdom. Al-Idrisi did not just draw a map. He orchestrated a colossal project, interviewing travelers, comparing existing maps, and compiling all the known data into a single, breathtaking work called the Tabula Rogeriana. This was not a simple circle with Jerusalem at its heart. It was a massive silver planisphere, a disk of engraved metal that portrayed the entire known world, and it came with a book of detailed commentary. The world it showed was staggering in its scope and accuracy, especially when compared to the European Mappa Mundi of the same era, where European charts might show Africa as a small, almost mythical southern rim. Al-Idrisi's map depicted the continent with a surprising sense of its true scale, correctly showing the Indian Ocean as open water, not landlocked as Ptolemy had insisted. His map dreamed of connections. It showed the flow of goods along the Silk Road, the bustling ports of the Indian subcontinent, and the intricate river systems of Central Asia with a clarity that would not be matched in Europe for centuries. This was a vision of the world as a web of commerce and communication, a place where knowledge moved as freely as spices. Why did this sophisticated tradition remain largely a parallel universe rather than merging with European thought? The answer lies in the very purpose of the maps. Islamic cartography was a science of the real, intended for administrators and merchants navigating a vast multicultural empire. European mapmaking was still, in many ways, an art of the spiritual. The crucial and often unacknowledged turning point would come later. As Portuguese caravels began creeping down the African coast, their captains carried maps that were secret state property. Many of these charts were not born from European discovery alone. They were heavily indebted to, and often direct copies of, Arabic Portolan Charts and navigational guides that had been meticulously developed over centuries. The coastlines were so accurate because Arab and Swahili sailors had already mapped them. The knowledge of monsoon winds in the Indian Ocean, so vital for Da Gama's final push to India, was knowledge that Arab dhows had been using for generations. The European age of exploration, in its frantic rush for riches, was sailing on a foundation of Islamic science. This parallel tradition stands as a silent, monumental correction to the history we often tell. It reminds us that the medieval world was not a single story of dragons and faith, but a chorus of competing and often far more advanced dreams drawn in ink. The saga of cartographic deception did not end with the age of parchment and quills. It found a stunning modern chapter in the controversial tale of the Vinland Map. Discovered in the 1950s, this document appeared to be a 15th century relic, a fragment of a lost world chart. Its incredible claim was drawn in a single, tantalizing line west of Greenland, a landmass labeled as Vinland. Here was apparent proof that Norse explorers had not only reached North America, but that a medieval cartographer had recorded it long before Columbus sailed. It promised to rewrite history, to shatter a national myth and elevate a new set of heroes. The map was met with a frenzy of excitement and skepticism, a modern echo of the same desire that once fueled the search for Prester John. We so badly want maps to be keys that unlock hidden doors in history. Scientific analysis, however, slowly unraveled the beautiful lie. The ink, upon meticulous examination, was found to contain a 20th century pigment, an anathema to a genuine medieval document. The parchment, while old, had likely been taken from a real book and redrawn with a deliberate, clever fraud. The Vinland Map stands not as a medieval artifact, but as a meta-lesson for our own time. It proves that the allure of the secret map, the one chart that overturns everything we thought we knew, is as potent today as it was 600 years ago. This modern forgery holds up a mirror to the ancient deceptions, reminding us that the line between a revolutionary discovery and an elaborate deceit is often just a single, carefully drawn line of ink. It forces a critical question upon us all. How do we assess the maps we use today, the digital charts and data visualizations that shape our understanding of the world? The agendas are still there, woven not into sheepskin but into algorithms and curated data sets. The dream of a perfectly truthful map remains just that, a dream, perpetually vulnerable to our own desires and the deceivers who know how to exploit them. Gold and spices flow like rivers across the parchment of the Catalan Atlas. Crafted in 1375 by the Majorcan Jewish cartographer Abraham Cresques, this work was commissioned not by a bishop but by a king, and its dream was of earthly dominion through commerce. It is a stunning hybrid, merging the practical, life-saving accuracy of the Portolan chart with the vast, encyclopedic ambition of a Mappa Mundi. The familiar Mediterranean coastline is rendered with a navigator's precision, its web of room lines guiding ships from port to port. But then the Atlas pulls your gaze south, across the vast blankness of the Sahara, to the Empire of Mali. There, seated majestically on a golden throne, is Mansa Musa, the legendary ruler whose pilgrimage to Mecca half a century earlier had flooded the Middle East with so much gold that it devalued currency for a generation. This was not a mythical beast drawn to terrify, but a real, powerful African emperor depicted with respect and clear economic interest. The Atlas meticulously traces the trans-Saharan trade routes that carried his gold north, acknowledging the sophisticated networks that existed entirely outside of Christendom. Further east, the map blooms with the wonders described by Marco Polo. The court of Kublai Khan appears, along with detailed depictions of Java and the Spice Islands, charting a world of immense wealth and complex civilizations that European monarchs could barely comprehend, yet desperately wanted to access. This was a radical departure. The Catalan Atlas did not dream of a unified Christendom, but of a connected globe, a vast, interlocking system where geography served commerce. It presented a pluralistic world where power was measured in gold and goods, not just in religious orthodoxy. Abraham Cresques, living at the cultural crossroads of Majorca, synthesized Jewish, Islamic, and Christian geographical knowledge to create this vision. His atlas was a bridge, one that looked back to medieval wonder and forward to modern globalization. It declared that to understand the world, you had to understand its markets, its trade winds, and the ambitions of all its kings, not just your own. The very parchment these maps were drawn on whispers a story of immense value and deliberate effort. This was not paper, a cheap and disposable material, but treated animal skin, a single sheet requiring the entire hide of a sheep or calf. The cost was staggering, making every blank page a significant investment before a single line was even drawn. The ink itself was a treasure. Brilliant blues were ground from lapis lazuli, a gemstone mined in distant Afghanistan and more precious than gold. Vivid reds came from vermilion, a pigment derived from toxic mercury, and shimmering highlights were laid down in actual gold leaf, painstakingly applied by hand. In the quiet, sunlit scriptoria of monasteries, the creation of a map was a slow, meditative act of devotion. A single error could ruin weeks of work and a small fortune in materials. This profound material reality dictated everything about the final product. Because the cost was so high, maps were never made on a whim. They were commissioned for a specific, powerful purpose by a king, a cardinal, or a wealthy merchant. The content was shaped by this patronage. A map intended for a royal treasury would be filled with strategic information, while one for a church might emphasize pilgrimage routes and holy sites. The incredible durability of parchment is the only reason we can hold these dreams in our hands today, centuries later. The texture of the vellum, the subtle cracking of the pigments, and the exquisite craftsmanship of the bindings are not just decorative details. They are a direct link to the past, a tangible record of the human labor, the economic power, and the sacred intention required to fix an entire vision of the world onto a single, precious surface. These were not casual sketches, they were cherished objects of immense power, and their physical form is the first clue to understanding the weight of the dreams they carried. Even the most scientific map can carry a hidden bias in its proportions. Take a look at a typical world map from the early Renaissance, and you might notice something strange about the shape of Africa. It often appears shrunken, almost huddled against the bottom edge, while Europe swells in size, prominently centered at the heart of the parchment. This was not a simple miscalculation. It was a subtle, profound deception that reshaped the global imagination. Africa, a continent of staggering scale, was systematically diminished, while Europe was visually inflated. The immense Sahara Desert might be drawn as a narrow strip, and the continent's southern reach would be truncated, making the entire landmass feel compact and knowable. Europe, by contrast, was rendered with exaggerated detail, its peninsulas sprawling and its kingdoms given ample space. Why would cartographers, armed with increasingly accurate Portolan charts, choose to distort the world in this way? Because a map is never just a representation of space. It is a reflection of priority and power. By shrinking Africa, mapmakers made its interior seem less imposing, its civilizations less significant, and its conquest a more manageable prospect. At the same time, placing an enlarged Europe at the visual center of the world reinforced a burgeoning sense of cultural and political destiny. This was a psychological conquest executed with a pen, making the world appear ordered around European interests long before its ships could dominate every ocean. The very scientific model they relied upon, Ptolemy's Geographia, cemented this era. His calculations famously underestimated the Earth's circumference and the true breadth of the African continent. That specific miscalculation created a tantalizing and completely false promise. It made the sea route to Asia around Africa seem impossibly long, while the westward journey across the Atlantic appeared tantalizingly short. This cartographic lie did not just sit on a shelf, it directly fueled the ambitions of explorers like Christopher Columbus, who trusted Ptolemy's shrunken world. He sailed west expecting a brief trip to the Indies, finding an entirely new world instead, all because of a fundamental distortion on a map. This Eurocentric framing, repeated across generations of atlases, trained people to see their continent as the default center of the world and all other lands as peripheral. What borders on your own mental map feel innate and natural when they might be the legacy of a 600-year-old deception? A new dream was taking shape, one that turned the gaze inward from the cosmic to the kingdom. Around the year 1360, a map was drawn that saw Britain not as a theological symbol, but as a physical body to be understood and managed. The Gough Map presents a startlingly recognizable outline of England and Wales, its coastlines rendered with an attention to detail that would feel at home on a modern road atlas. But its true revolution lies within its borders, for it is crisscrossed by a delicate web of lines connecting hundreds of settlements. This was not a map for the soul's pilgrimage to Jerusalem. It was a map for a royal official's journey from York to London. The dream here was one of national identity, a vision of the kingdom as a single, unified, and traversable space. Why would such a map emerge at this precise moment? Because the power of secular monarchies was consolidating. A king could not rule what he could not see or comprehend. This parchment was a tool for effective governance, allowing for the movement of troops, the collection of taxes, and the administration of justice across the realm. It transformed the abstract idea of a nation into a tangible, manageable entity. Distances between towns are carefully noted, not in divine allegory, but in practical travel days. The map's very existence signaled a profound shift from a world ordered by faith to one organized by bureaucracy. It was a dream of control, of a land knitted together by roads and loyalties, all flowing toward a central authority. This was the blueprint for the modern state, drawn in ink centuries before its full realization. The cartographer's pen was no longer just illustrating power, it was becoming an essential instrument of it. Every road drawn was a thread stitching the nation together, and every town marked was a point of control in an emerging administrative machine. What does your own country's road map silently say about its central authority and the dream of unity it seeks to project? That potent mix of spiritual yearning and cartographic fiction did not simply fade away. It launched ships. When Christopher Columbus set sail westward across the Atlantic, he was not navigating by the stars alone. He was steering directly into a dreamscape drawn on parchment, a world shaped by profound miscalculation and marvelous lies. His cabin would have held maps steeped in Ptolemy's ancient era, which shrank the Earth's true size, and journals filled with Marco Polo's embellished accounts of the Orient's endless riches. Columbus read these not as stories but as fact. He believed so completely in this cartographic vision that when he made landfall in the Caribbean, he was certain he had reached the outer islands of Asia. His monumental discovery was, in a very real sense, a product of medieval deception. He found a new world because his maps had convinced him the old one was configured differently. At the very same time, Portuguese caravels were inching down the African coastline, driven by a different kind of map myth. Their captains, clutching charts that still placed the kingdom of Prester John somewhere in the Ethiopian highlands, were desperate to find this legendary Christian ally. They hoped to outflank the Islamic world and secure a partner in their quest for global trade dominance. Every blank space on their maps was not an empty void, but a potential gateway to his fabled realm. The practical tools for these perilous journeys came from the Portolan tradition, those dense webs of room lines perfected for navigating the Mediterranean were now stretched across the open ocean. They provided the technical confidence to leave sight of land for weeks, trusting the compass and the chart to lead them to destinations previously only whispered about. The medieval map, therefore, was the silent partner on every voyage. It was a hybrid creature patched together from returning sailors' hard-won coordinates and the stubborn, beautiful fantasies of dragons and Christian kings. This combustible mixture of emerging fact and enduring fiction created an irresistible impetus. It told European explorers that the unknown was not just a place of terror, but a landscape of infinite possibility, where every myth might be real and every blank space held a fortune. The dreamers and deceivers working on Parchment centuries before had ultimately charted the course to a geographical and historical cataclysm, one that would shatter their own ordered world and create the one we recognize today. The most enduring deception was not about the shape of the land, but the nature of the people living on it. As European ships returned from distant coasts, cartographers faced a new challenge: how to categorize the stunning diversity of human cultures they described. Their solution was to invent a geography of race directly on the parchment. A 15th-century map might label a region of Africa not only with its name, but with a description of its inhabitants as monstrous or barbarous. Europe, by stark contrast, would be annotated as the home of civilized and pious peoples. This was a deliberate, calculated shift. It moved the monstrous races from the symbolic edges of the world into the very heart of inhabited continents, attaching these dehumanizing labels to real human populations. The cynosphali, the dog-headed men, were no longer just a fable for the edge of the map. They became a stand-in for entire ethnic groups, their supposed existence used as proof of a natural hierarchy. This cartographic lie did something profoundly dangerous. It transformed simple cultural difference, things like language, dress, and custom, into a sign of inherent biological destiny. The map suggested that a person's character and capabilities were dictated by the latitude of their birth, written into the very soil. This pseudo-scientific categorization provided a ready-made moral alibi for the horrors that followed. How could it be a sin to enslave a barbarian? How could it be wrong to take land from a monstrous race? The Parchment had already judged them as less than human, turning conquest into a civilizing mission and exploitation into a natural order. This was perhaps the cartographers' most pernicious legacy. They drew the lines that divided humanity into us and them, lines that were not just geographical but epistemological. They created a visual argument for inequality that would be cited for centuries, justifying systems of oppression that began with a single, deceptive label placed carefully on a map. In a quiet Venetian monastery, a monk named Fra Mauro was quietly dismantling the classical world. His great map, drawn around 1450, is a massive circle of ink and ambition that feels like the last great medieval encyclopedia and the first modern atlas all at once. Fra Mauro dreamed not of a perfect spiritual order, but of a perfect synthesis of all available knowledge. He was an obsessive editor of reality, comparing the ancient authority of Ptolemy against the fresh, startling accounts of merchants who had actually walked the streets of Cathay. And when they contradicted, he made a revolutionary choice. He sided with the travelers. His map is filled with cautious, critical notes, phrases like "it is said" or "some report," revealing a mind that understood the difference between hearsay and evidence. This was a new kind of dream, one of scholarly humility and empirical correction. He dared to show the Indian Ocean as open water, defying Ptolemy's long-held belief that it was landlocked because Arab and Indian sailors knew otherwise. He filled the spaces once reserved for monsters with meticulously drawn trading cities and complex river deltas, charting the kingdoms of India and the islands of the Pacific with a detail that was unprecedented in Europe. Perhaps his most profound act of defiance was his orientation. He placed south at the top of his world. This single decision shattered the unspoken hierarchy of the North-Up Convention that would later dominate, forcing the viewer to see Europe from a new, peripheral angle. It was a visual declaration that the world did not, in fact, revolve around Christendom. Fra Mauros's map is a beautiful contradiction, a bridge built from both faith and reason. It holds the medieval desire to capture everything in one image, yet it eagerly embraces the fragmentary, uncertain data that would soon explode that very desire. It is the last and greatest work of its kind, a testament to a moment when the old dreams could still hold the new world, just before the flood of discovery washed them all away for good. Your first instinct with a medieval map is probably wrong. You are not looking at a failed geography test. You are reading a complex language of faith and power, and to understand it, you must abandon modern expectations entirely. Begin by asking not where you are, but which way you are facing. The top of the map is not necessarily north. On many of these charts, like the vast Hereford Mappa Mundi, the top is east, the direction of the rising sun, and the sacred location of the Garden of Eden. This orientation immediately reorients your entire perspective, pulling your gaze toward the divine. Next, find the center. In this world view, the center is not a geometric point, it is a spiritual one. You will almost always find Jerusalem right there, the navel of the world, the axis around which all of history turns. Its central placement is a deliberate statement, telling you that this city is the heart of the story, the most important place on earth. Now learn to read the symbols. Those intricate little circles with towers are not just dots, they represent mighty cities. Wavy blue lines snaking across the parchment are rivers, the lifeblood of kingdoms and the boundaries of empires. Pay close attention to color and figures. A specific hue or the depiction of a person in a certain type of clothing is rarely accidental. It often denotes a different people or religion, visually separating the familiar from the foreign. And those fantastical creatures in the margins, the dragons and the dog-headed men, are not zoological errors. They are moral and cultural commentary, graphic representations of the monstrous other that lies beyond the borders of the known, civilized world. Do not search for a consistent scale or accurate distance. They are irrelevant here. Instead, look for narrative and hierarchy. What is drawn the largest? It is likely the most important, not the biggest in physical size. What is rendered in the most excruciating gold leaf detail? That is what the mapmaker and his patron wanted you to value most. And perhaps most tellingly, ask yourself what is missing. What entire regions or peoples have been omitted from this version of reality? When you start asking these questions, the map transforms before your eyes. It ceases to be a primitive chart and becomes a stunningly successful piece of storytelling, a direct line into the medieval mind, revealing its deepest priorities, its most profound fears, and its most ambitious dreams for a world ordered by faith. The ghost of the medieval mapmaker did not vanish with the arrival of the printing press. It simply found new tools. Those same techniques of selective omission and persuasive distortion are now engineered into the very fabric of our digital world. Consider the modern propaganda map, a direct descendant of the charts that once shrank Africa and enlarged Europe. Today, nations release world maps where their own territorial claims are rendered in bold, aggressive colors, while disputed borders vanish into thin air. An island in the South China Sea might balloon to 10 times its true size, a visual argument for dominance drawn not on vellum, but in a diplomatic briefing. The goal is identical to the medieval cartographer working for a king to make an ambition look like a geographical fact. Corporate interests wield the same power. A retail chain publishes a map of its nationwide locations, a sparkling network of success. What it deliberately omits are the vast service deserts in poor rural areas, the blank spaces that speak louder than the dots. This is not a map of where stores are, it is a map of where the company believes profit lies, hiding inconvenient truths behind a cheerful infographic. But the most pervasive deception is now personalized. The algorithms that shape your social media feed and search results are your own private cartographer, drawing a unique and deeply biased map of the information universe. It highlights the news and opinions you are likely to agree with, creating well-worn paths of thought, while quietly erasing dissenting viewpoints into blank, unexplored territories. This digital filter bubble is the modern equivalent of a medieval Mappa Mundi, a self-affirming reality that comforts you by showing you a world that revolves around your own beliefs. The core lesson from those ancient parchments has never been more urgent. Every map, whether drawn on sheepskin or generated by code, is a subjective argument. It is created by someone for a purpose with a built-in point of view. The most critical skill we can inherit from the past is not the ability to read a map, but the courage to interrogate it. Who funded this chart? What story does it need to tell? And most importantly, what has been left out of the picture? The enduring gift of the medieval dreamers and deceivers is this essential skepticism, a reminder that the world we perceive is often just the one someone else has carefully drawn for us. The power to draw the world has finally begun to shift. While the history of cartography is paved with beautiful lies, a new and radically different dream is taking shape in the digital age, one that champions the ethical mapmaker. This modern vision actively works to undo centuries of exclusion, turning the map from an instrument of conquest into a tool for reclamation. Across the globe, indigenous mapping initiatives are leading this charge. They are not simply adding data to existing charts. They are fundamentally redrawing the narrative, restoring original place names that hold deep cultural and spiritual meaning, names that colonial cartographers erased and replaced. A mountain is no longer just a peak on a topographical survey. It becomes a sacred site known for generations by a name that tells its story. A river regains its ancestral identity, reconnecting a community to its history and its role as an environmental guardian. This is cartography as an act of healing, a deliberate correction of the historical record written on the land itself. Alongside this, a parallel revolution is unfolding through open-source platforms like OpenStreetMap. This project dreams of a geography built not by a single corporation or government, but by a global community of contributors. It is a living, breathing atlas created by people on the ground, who can map the footpath through their own neighborhood, the small shop around the corner, and the vital resources that a corporate algorithm might ignore. This is democratized knowledge in its purest form, a direct challenge to the controlled information of the past. The dream of the ethical cartographer is not about perfection, but about intention. It seeks representation for the underrepresented, accuracy born from local experience, and inclusivity as its core principle. It asks a profound question of the modern world. What stories are still missing from our maps? This evolving ethos proves that the same power once used to dominate can be harnessed for empowerment, transforming a parchment of deception into a platform for shared truth and reconciliation. From the God-centered TO maps to the merchant-driven Portolan Charts, the cartographers of conquest taught us a profound and enduring lesson. Every map is an argument, a dream, and sometimes a deliberate lie. They revealed that parchment is never a passive surface. It is a battleground for ideologies, a quiet war of ink where faith, power, and raw human imagination collide in a struggle to define reality itself. The legacy they left us is a double-edged sword. With one hand, they gave humanity the essential tools to navigate the vast, terrifying oceans, to connect continents, and to finally comprehend the physical scale of our planet. With the other hand, they provided the very blueprints for its subjugation, drafting the justifications for conquest and drawing the lines that divided humanity into the civilized and the monstrous. This story of medieval mapmaking is, in the end, a deeply human story about us. It speaks to our endless, aching desire to make sense of our place in the cosmos, to find order in the chaos. Yet it also exposes our troubling, persistent tendency to reshape that very cosmos to fit our own desires, our fears, and our ambitions for control. As we glance at the glowing GPS screen on our phone or trust the digital chart in our car, we are still reading maps. The medium has changed from vellum to pixels, but the fundamental challenge remains. The most vital skill for any navigator, whether crossing an ocean or navigating the information landscape, is not just knowing where you are. It is understanding who drew the lines you are following and for what purpose. Let this journey into the past serve as a lens for viewing our own world. Look at the news you are fed, the social media feeds you scroll, or the corporate infographics you see. Where do you see a modern map, a visualization of the world that contains a hidden dream or a subtle deception? Share what you find in the comments below.